Okay, video number 3. So we left off when we're looking at this thinking map of problems and solutions that the Europeans had. They want the trade goods from Asia. The Silk Road has collapsed and crumbled with the Ottoman Empire. Well, excuse me, not the Ottoman Empire, but the Mongolian Empire. It becomes very unsafe. They first have to develop the technology to be able to get to Asia, and then the dangers. So this will continue on. So to hold this off to the side, and we're going to talk about the dangers as we go through the next few slides. And expenses and voyages, how do they get around these problems, right? There's certain dangers. How do you get around those dangers? What's the solution? What's the solution to the expense? So we also have to think about where are you going to go? You've got the ships. You have a desire. Where do you go? Where do you explore first? Where do you head to? And which nations? Which nations are going to say, yes, this is what I want to do? So at this point, we're also looking at basically the race for trade routes, because if you can be number one to get there, you can stake your claim, you can put your flag in the ground, you can say, this is mine, I control it, I control the trade, therefore I control the wealth, and I control the economy, right? And so I put these in the order, so there's no guess on who went first and who came last, but that doesn't always mean that you stay in power. That is another lesson. All right, so Portugal is going to be the first to Africa, and Africa is where they're going to head to. Because if we look at where Portugal is, you see right underneath there, we have Africa. Obviously, you can barely see Algeria underneath there, Libya. You see the islands off in the Atlantic Ocean. All right, so it's going to be the Portuguese, because why the Portuguese, you ask me? Because of Prince Henry the Navigator. So Prince Henry was a very wealthy man. He never sailed himself. This was an honorary title that he was given. But Prince Henry had lots of money, and he had a desire for Portugal to be successful. So when you think Portugal, letter P, think Prince Henry, okay? And Prince Henry is a really good thinker. He brings together the best of the best. Prince Henry's the reason why the caravel was created. Prince Henry's the reason the caravel was created was because he brought together the best shipbuilders. He brought together the best map makers, the best sailors of the time. And he said, let's put this together. And basically, it was like an academy for maritime knowledge. And this is why the Portuguese are able to succeed. And again, you've probably heard the phrase location, location, location. Look at where Portugal is. They're surrounded by the Atlantic Ocean on two sides, right? They're pretty much a little tiny rectangle there. They actually go on to become the wealthiest nation in the beginning of the 1500s, the most wealthiest and powerful nation, right? And so if we look at where Portugal is and compare it to Africa, you can see why Africa is a logical choice. Where are you going to go next? They know how to sail around Europe. That they can stay close in, they can go into the Mediterranean Sea. They've been doing that for hundreds of years. Let's explore and let's go out to Africa. And at first, they don't just go to Africa, they actually head to islands off the coast, the Madeiras, the Canary Islands, the Cape Verde Islands. And so they start to explore that. They also are going to be the first to enslave people from Africa. All right, so Africa's where they're first heading. Now, here's again another problem with Africa. Where you see that line is, that's not the equator, it's actually below the equator. But sailors had this superstition of referring to it as the sea of darkness, right? So think of like the Kraken's going to come out of the ocean and swallow you up. And they just sort of like this big black hole of sea that you could just disappear into. Nobody had ever gone around, sort of, they call that the Horn of Africa. They had never gone around that western part of Africa, mainly because they didn't have the ships to navigate it. They didn't have any maps. They just felt you just collapse into the ocean would just swallow you up. Right. So you can see here by all these blue lines, right, that the Portuguese very quickly understand that you can get around Africa. And they start doing these like little, if you look, it's like a little hop. We go to one island, we go back home. We secure that island, we get a trading post. right? We know that we can get food there, we can get fresh water there, we can repair our ships there. Up, let's go a little bit further, and we can always go back to that base. So it's like if Portugal is point A, and then the Cape Verde Islands are point B. Go from A to B, B to A, right? Oh, wait, we can now go to Senegal or the west coast of Africa. Okay, west coast of Africa is point C. You go back to the Cape Verde Islands, go back to Portugal. Okay, that's a safe trip. And so little by little, they start making their way around until you get around the southern point of Africa. Now, why is that a big deal, you ask? I will tell you. It's a big deal because of the currents. So I'll try to put in your primary sources a map of the ocean currents and the winds that you have going around there. So you have ocean currents going one way, you have winds going another. Very, very hard to maneuver ships around the Cape of Good Hope, that southern part. And then you see they're still doing that little hopping part, and they're going up around the east side of Africa. And eventually they sail straight across to Calicut. Calicut's going to be the first place they come to in India, and then from India, they go out and they start searching on through the Pacific Ocean. And you see where the red trade routes are, right? So with the trade routes, if you look, the arrows are going from east in China, west to Europe. If we look at the blue, right? The blue lines are going from Portugal east to India and then on to Asia. All right, so make it safer, right? The dangers that they had. Ships that are ocean worthy, you have to communicate the best sea routes. You have to develop trading posts in far off lands so that you have repairs, fresh water, and food. And so this isn't like, boom, we're in China. This is going to be taking baby steps. In order to run a half marathon, you run a mile. And then you run 2 miles, then you run 3, and then you run 4. And so you don't start off by, boom, running a half marathon, or a marathon, because, hey, that guy died, right? You do it in increments and you train for it. And as it gets safer and easier, then you can go further. All right. So next problem that we have, right, is the expense of the voyage. You've got to buy the ships. These are not cheap, right? Think about buying a cruise ship. How much money would that cost you, right? You have to pay your sailors that are going to go with you. They're not going to go for free, right? It's not like a cruise vacation. They're going to have to work. They're going to be gone from home for weeks, months, possibly years. Very dangerous. You have storms that you can't control. You have pirates, native people who may not want you where you're going, right? And storms that can come up. So many opportunities to have failures. So what some countries do, or some people do, is to create what are called joint stock companies. And they're basically what we would call business today, right? A very big business. And the idea was that you could have 5, 10, 20 men invest in a corporation, such as the Virginia Company or the London Company, and they would say, we're going to buy 10 ships. And we're going to outfit 10 ships with sailors, and we're going to pay, go to Africa, and we're going to get some trade goods. If 2 ships fail, they sink, they don't get the goods, the pirates take them. 2's not bad because we still have 8 other ships. If you're one person and you own one ship and that one ship fails, you've lost everything. So it was a way to share in risks and profits. And it's what we would call taking shares of a company today. When your company benefits, you benefit. When your company loses, you lose, but you don't lose as much as if you were the sole owner. Right? So they were created to invest and trade. These had to be approved by the king or queen. You don't just create it on your own. You actually had to prepare documents, a contract. It would be sent to the king. The king's privy council or queen would look at it and they would approve it or deny it, and they would say, yes, you're approved. Right, so you had to have a seal of approval by the monarch. So when we talk about charter colonies and proprietary colonies, a lot of them are owned by joint stock companies. Dutch West India is probably the most famous joint stock company. The Virginia Company who first settles in the British colonies. That is also a joint stock company. So Jamestown, Virginia was settled by a joint stock trading company. They were there for a profit. They are not owned by a king or queen, but they just have permission from the king or queen. Right? So the Dutch, English, and French had joint stock companies because their kings and queens weren't funding them. The Spanish and Portuguese, on the other hand, those monarchs were willing to take the risk. But that also meant that the profits went directly to them. Yes, they paid their captains of the ships. Yes, they had to buy the ships. But the profit was going solely into the king or government's pockets. All right, so with expensive voyages and risk of failure, we see the Dutch, French, and English are going to create joint stock companies to share in the risk and wealth. And kings and queens in Spain and Portugal are willing to take on that expense because remember, they are also very Catholic nations and they feel it is sort of their duty as Catholic Christians to spread their faith and that God will then, give them back even more. And so that is part of it. And also power. They want power. You have that small country of Portugal. So when you see that red plus sign, right, looks like a cross on the ship there, that is the sign of the Catholic Pope. And so the Portuguese ships, Columbus's ships, they would have this on their sails. And that was a sign that they were sailing for the Catholic Church, not for a country. Although they were sailing for a country. But it just shows how much the idea of spreading their faith was part of this motivation. Okay, so Portuguese are heading around Africa. They're heading east, right? And then Columbus's idea is, I'm going to go west. I'm not going to compete with the Portuguese. I'm going to take the shortcut. And so as Columbus is settling into the Caribbean, in the southern part of that map, and he goes back 6 times. He's looking for a passage. He does not believe that this is solid land. Look where they have California on this map, right? It's not even attached. They really believe there's somehow a river or a break between North and South America that they can cut through. Now, the French, English, Dutch, not wanting to compete with the Spanish, not wanting to fight with them, they believe there's a Northwest Passage, that there is a river way through the northern part of North America. So you're going to have Henry Hudson sailing around New York, what's now New York City, what's now going up into Hudson River, and he thinks, man, he hit pay dirt. He thinks he's really going to get there until he realizes it's fresh water, and then you know that you're not hitting an ocean. And then the French with the St. Lawrence River, the same thing. They really think that they're finding that Northwest Passage and they're going to get through and have a shortcut through to Asia. So even though the Americas are settled, that main motivation in the beginning is to cut through that land. A lot of the nations just see, okay, it's land, it's great, we'll come back to the land, we'll settle that later, let's get to Asia. And so nobody stops wanting to go to Asia. Nobody stops wanting those trade goods. All right, so again, looking for the information, Portugal, first to sail to and around Africa. In 1488, they sailed around it to India, and that is Diaz who does that. All right, number 2, we have Spain. In 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue and ends up in the Caribbean Sea, or what we now call the West Indies, because he felt he made to India. He felt he was in the Indian islands, and so that's why people are still referred to sometimes as Indians, or were at one time, because he felt he was in India. It was not a slur against the people. He just felt like, oh, this is just an island nobody knew about, right? And Columbus sails 5 more times. So he goes to the Americas 6 times. This is not like a once and done. He's repeating it. And in the process, they're realizing, wait, there's good resources here. But he's still also looking for that passage to Asia, right? And then we have the English in 1497. King Henry sends for explorer Cabot, John Cabot, to explore, and he finds Newfoundland, right? Not a whole lot of exploring. There's going to be a little bit under his daughter, Queen Elizabeth, but honestly, most of the colonies fail. So we don't hear too much from the English for a while. Then the French, they decide to join the party. 1524, we have Verrazano sailing from North Carolina up the East Coast all the way up to Maine. If you ever travel around New York City, there's the Verrazano Bridge, there's the Verrazano Narrows, which is the waterway between the islands and the mainland of New York, right? And then in 1534, Jacques Cartier, he is successful. He finds Nez Perce Rock, which is up by the St. Lawrence River. So Verrazano maps a lot, and Verrazano is very important to understanding of North America. But it's Cartier who really says, okay, I found a way, and he thinks he's found the Northwest Passage. All right, and then last but not least, we have the Dutch in 1609. And they explore the Hudson River, or rather, Henry Hudson explores the Hudson River. And they create New Netherlands. So 1609, we have the Dutch coming in, and they're setting up a colony. And they're quickly taking advantage of the resources. And I'm going to include some maps on your primary sources for you to look at and analyze. But just look at the difference and how the technology of map making was so important, right? We have, I was trying to move my face here, 1554 map of Africa. And I love this map because they show you kingdoms, tribal kingdoms within Africa, and the ship going around, but look at the dimensions of Africa, right? So off the mark. And then in 1584, look how much it's changed. So in 50 years, look at the change in Africa and the knowledge that has come from all of the different sailings that have progressed. All right, so that is the end, right? And then here's a 1664 map. All right, and I love this map because, again, it shows us the people. It shows us some of the trading post cities at the top of the map. It shows you, look at all the ships, right? So many ships in the water. And it shows you the animals. This is a wonderful map. I'll try to include this with the primary sources. And so just to finish up, main thing is motivation. Catholic monarchs want to spread their religion, God, glory, competition for power, greed, gold, desire for wealth from trade for both kings and merchants, people, and traders. So that's it for week 1. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you for week 2.